The Middle East is a region of great diversity and complexity. It is the birthplace of some of the oldest civilizations and religions in the world. It is also the home of many different ethnic groups and cultures, each with their own history and identity. But who were the original inhabitants of this land? And what became of them? How did they interact with each other and with the empires and invaders that came later? And how do their descendants today relate to their ancient heritage and traditions? In this story, we will explore the lives and fates of 4 of the most prominent tribes that lived in the Middle East before 1000 AD. The Canaanites, the Philistines, the Amorites, and the Hebrews.
Part 1. The Canaanites.
The Canaanites were one of the earliest and most influential people of the Middle East. They lived in the area that is now Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan from about 3000 BC to 1200 BC. They spoke a Semitic language and developed a rich and sophisticated culture with cities, trade, writing, art, and religion. They worshipped many gods and goddesses, such as Baal, El, Asherah, and Anat, and practiced rituals such as sacrifice, divination, and sacred prostitution. They also had a complex social and political structure with kings, nobles, priests, and commoners.
But who were the Canaanites really? Where did they come from? And how did they relate to their neighbors? The answer is not so simple. The term Canaanite is actually a generic name given by the ancient Egyptians, who referred to the people living in the land of Canaan as Canana. The Canaanites themselves did not have a unified identity or a common name.
They were a collection of different city-states, such as Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Ugarit, and Jerusalem, each with their own history and culture. They also had different origins and affiliations. Some of them were descendants of the original inhabitants of the land, who had mixed with the newcomers from the east, such as the Amorites and the Hurrians. Others were immigrants from the coast, who had come from the islands of the Mediterranean, such as Cyprus and Crete. These were the people who would later be known as the Phoenicians and the Philistines. The Canaanites had a turbulent and often violent relationship with their neighbors. They were frequently invaded and conquered by the powerful empires of the region, such as the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. They also had to contend with the nomadic tribes that roamed the desert, such as the Amalekites, the Midianites, and the Edomites. And they had to deal with the rise of a new and distinctive people who claimed to have a special covenant with the one and only GD, the Hebrews.
Part 2. The Philistines.
The Philistines were one of the most mysterious and enigmatic people of the Middle East. They lived in the coastal plain of what is now southern Israel and the Gaza Strip from about 1200 BC to 600 BC. They spoke an Indo-European language and had a distinctive material culture with pottery, metalwork, weapons, and architecture. They worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses, such as Dagon, Astarte, and Beelzebub, and practiced rituals such as circumcision, animal sacrifice, and human sacrifice. They also had a strong military and political organization with 5 major cities, each ruled by a king or a lord, and a council of elders.
But who were the Philistines really? Where did they come from? And how did they relate to their neighbors? The answer is not very clear. The term Philistine is actually a derogatory name given by the ancient Hebrews, who referred to them as Pelishtim, meaning invaders or foreigners. The Philistines themselves did not have a common name or a clear origin.
They were part of a larger group of people who migrated from the Aegean Sea to the eastern Mediterranean around the 12th century BC. These people are known as the Sea Peoples, and they caused havoc and destruction wherever they went. They attacked and plundered the civilizations of the region, such as the Hittites, the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and the Israelites. Some of them settled in the land of Canaan and became known as the Philistines. Others continued their raids and migrations and became known as the Sicels, the Etruscans, the Sardinians, and the Trojans. The Philistines had a hostile and often violent relationship with their neighbors. They were constantly at war with the Israelites, who saw them as their arch enemies and oppressors. They also had to face the threats and invasions of the empires of the region, such as the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks. And they had to deal with the assimilation and acculturation of their own people, who gradually adopted the languages, religions, and customs of the Canaanites and the Israelites.
Part 3. The Amorites.
The Amorites were one of the most influential and powerful people of the Middle East. They lived in the area that is now Syria, Iraq, and Jordan from about 2000 BC to 1600 BC. They spoke a Semitic language and had a nomadic and pastoral lifestyle, with flocks of sheep, goats, and camels. They worshipped many gods and goddesses, such as Amurru, Ishtar, Shamash, and Marduk, and practiced rituals such as ancestor worship, divination, and magic. They also had a strong military and political organization, with clans, tribes, and kingdoms.
But who were the Amorites really? Where did they come from? And how did they relate to their neighbors? The answer is quite interesting. The term Amorite is actually a name given by the ancient Sumerians, who referred to them as Amurru, meaning Westerners or Highlanders. The Amorites themselves did not have a unified identity or a common name.
They were a diverse and dynamic group of people who had different origins and affiliations. Some of them were descendants of the original inhabitants of the land, who had mixed with the newcomers from the west, such as the Canaanites and the Hurrians. Others were immigrants from the desert, who had come from the Arabian Peninsula, such as the Kedarites and the Nabateans. And some of them were conquerors and founders of new empires, such as the Babylonians and the Ammonites. The Amorites had a complex and varied relationship with their neighbors. They were sometimes allies and sometimes enemies of the civilizations of the region, such as the Cimmerians, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Hittites, and the Egyptians. They also had to contend with the internal conflicts and divisions among their own people, such as the wars between the Babylonians and the Ammonites, or the rebellions of the Kedarites and the Nabateans. And they had to deal with the rise and fall of their own empires, which left behind a lasting legacy and influence on the history and culture of the Middle East.
Part 4. The Hebrews.
The Hebrews were one of the most unique and remarkable people of the Middle East. They lived in the area that is now Israel, Palestine, and Jordan from about 1800 BC to 600 BC. They spoke a Semitic language and had a semi-nomadic and agricultural lifestyle, with crops, vineyards, and orchards. They worshipped one and only one God, Yahweh, and practiced rituals such as circumcision, Sabbath, Passover, and sacrifice. They also had a special covenant and relationship with God, who chose them as his people and gave them his laws and promises.
But who were the Hebrews really? Where did they come from? And how did they relate to their neighbors? The answer is quite fascinating. The term Hebrew is actually a name given by the ancient Egyptians, who referred to them as Apiru, meaning wanderers or outcasts. The Hebrews themselves did not have a common name or a clear origin.
They were a diverse and dynamic group of people who had different origins and affiliations. Some of them were descendants of the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had migrated from Mesopotamia to Canaan and had formed the tribes of Israel. Others were immigrants from the desert, who had joined the Israelites under the leadership of Moses, who had led them out of slavery in Egypt and had given them the Torah, the law of God. And some of them were converts and proselytes, who had adopted the faith and culture of the Israelites, such as the Kenites, the Rechabites, and the Ruthites. The Hebrews had a complex and varied relationship with their neighbors. They were sometimes allies and sometimes enemies of the people of the region, such as the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Amorites, and the Egyptians. They also had to contend with the internal conflicts and divisions among their own people, such as the wars between the tribes of Israel, the split between the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and the rebellions of the prophets and the zealots. And they had to deal with the rise and fall of their own kingdoms, which left behind a lasting legacy and influence on the history and religion of the world.
Conclusion.
The Canaanites, the Philistines, the Amorites, and the Hebrews were four of the many tribes that lived in the Middle East before 1000 AD. They had different origins, cultures, religions, and faiths. They also had different connections and claims to their ancient heritage and traditions. Some of them preserved and honored their ancestors' customs and beliefs, such as the Hebrews, who became the Jews, and the Phoenicians, who became the Lebanese. Others changed and adapted their ancestors' customs and beliefs, such as the Philistines, who some claim became the Palestinians, and the Ammonites, who became the Jordanians. And some of them lost and forgot their ancestors' customs and beliefs, such as the Canaanites, who disappeared from history, and the Babylonians, who assimilated into other cultures.
But what does it mean to be a descendant of these ancient tribes? Does it depend on blood or faith or culture or history? And how do we know who is a true descendant and who is not? These are not easy questions to answer.
They have been debated and disputed for centuries, and they still have relevance and significance today. They touch upon issues of identity, belonging, heritage, and legacy. They also affect issues of politics, conflict, and peace. They are questions that challenge us to think about who we are, where we come from, and where we are going. Thank you for watching this story. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. If you did, please like, share, and follow me. And if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. I would love to hear from you. Until next time, we're signing off.